And when everything else didn't work, when all of those things that were being suggested to me didn't line up with what was truth inside of me, it's almost like there was a sword. You could call it the sword of truth. That part of me inside, that solidarity of truth, that sword of truth that can cut through all the other things, was very clear inside of me. There is something else. There is something else. And so the power of that blade, if you will, and I guess I'm relating to it like that because that's how it feels. It cuts through all that other stuff. It cuts through the no one's validating you, Sarah, right? It cuts through the it's all in your head. Like when you know that isn't your reality, there's almost a rushing instead of I'm going to cover my head and curl up under the covers and just disappear because no one believes me.
Welcome to Consciousness Compass. And before we begin today's transmission, I need to name something that may feel a little bit uncomfortable. We live in a culture that has no language for what happens when the instrument of consciousness itself is shattered, and when someone experiences brain injury or chronic illness or what we call invisible conditions. The medical system, from what I've seen, may offer two responses: either fix it or learn to live with it. But I see there's a third possibility that our materialist culture refuses to acknowledge. Because what if these experiences are not only obstacles to overcome, but what if they're initiatory portals into expanded perception? Now, I've spent the best part of 30 years studying consciousness through the lenses of evolutionary astrology and archetypal psychology and depth work, with clients navigating their underworlds. I can tell you this with certainty: some of the most profound expansion of human awareness happens not through spiritual practice or peak experiences, but through the brutal dismemberment at times of trauma and illness. My guest today is Dr. Sarah Young, a medical speech language pathologist with a doctorate in integrative medicine, who specializes in brain injury and what she calls the quantum dimension of healing. But those credentials are not why she's here. She's here because she's walked through her own neurological descent, multiple brain injuries, surgeries, a year-long recovery that cracked open her perception in ways I would suggest her academic training never prepared her for. And Sarah works at the intersection of neuroscience and the numinous trauma and transformation, the measurable and the mysterious. And I would suggest most practitioners may not want to name, and this is consciousness after injury, because it's often more expansive and more perceptive and more attuned to invisible realities than consciousness beforehand. In this conversation, we're going to hear Sarah's journey in her own words and her own frameworks. And at key moments, I want to offer what I see in her soul's blueprint, the archetypal patterns and wound signatures that help us understand not just what happened to her, but why Sarah was carrying this particular wound that will become this particular medicine. Now, I see this as rare territory, also genuine dialogue between two ways of understanding consciousness transformation. So I don't see this as a conversation only about hope or recovery in the conventional sense. I see this as descent as doorway and fragmentation as reorganization, and the incurable wound as the deepest teaching. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Peter.
You're most welcome. Your work most explicitly, but most practitioners avoid, is the recognition that brain injury can open perception rather than just damaging it. And you write about consciousness after injury, about trauma opening new channels. And that's precise and unflinching language. I don't see you're romanticizing suffering, but you're also not denying that something expanded in you through the injury. I want you to take us inside your descent. What happened to your consciousness when your brain was injured? And when did you first recognize that something was opening, not only breaking?
Well, I think that part of it is we're conditioned to be in the world, to be in our body, to see solid objects, to interact with things in a very concrete way. And for me, when I experienced brain injury, the lines became to blur a bit, and I wasn't able to connect to those physical objects and things in my environment in the same way. That's where not being able to find my words or not being able to remember things in the physical became very apparent. But the undercurrent of that is that other things were moving. There was an undercurrent inside of me that was opening into things that I didn't understand and other people didn't understand either. So I began to see through layers and see the way that things were working that didn't have any physical explanation. It's kind of hard to describe to you, but there's a lot of examples I could use. One might be that after that last brain injury, it was a car accident that resulted in really significant nerve damage in my abdominal region. At the time, I had an AccuMat that I used for my back and some issues that I had going on there. But I kind of got that inner voice that I was a little disconnected from before the injury that whispered, you should lay on your stomach on that mat. And why would I do that? That's not what that's for. That's for my back. That's not for my stomach. That's really strange and weird. And no, I'm not doing that. But then that voice would say, lay on your stomach. It was very clear. And again, a second time, I said, that's ridiculous. That's not what this is for. Why would I do that? And just went on about my business. But the third time, it said, just do it, basically. And so I followed that direction. It ends up, that's actually how I healed the nerve damage in my abdomen. I no longer have nerve, like I can have sensation now. That's a very relatively small example, but other examples might be I saw the pandemic before it happened. So my car accident was in April of 2019, which is before any of that happened. And I can distinctly remember sitting on my back porch, which after my brain injury, I did a lot of just sitting outside on my yoga mat, doing yoga, watching the trees. That's about all I could do at that point in my life. And I had a very distinct experience inside of me of the world being very different, businesses being closed, people not being on the streets, everybody holding up. And it was very terrifying. And I thought I was losing my mind. I thought I was going crazy. And I would tell people in my life, like, I had this experience and it's so weird and I don't know what that is. A lot of the people that I knew at the time were like, yeah, Sarah, I think you're losing it a little bit. That brain injury knocked some stuff loose. But it wasn't obviously until much later when the world changed and things really did start to show up exactly as I had seen them that I realized that, oh, maybe that wasn't me being crazy. Maybe that was being more open, because having a brain injury kind of forced me into this etheric space that wasn't really physical, but it wasn't really mental either. It was like existing in an in-between, if you will.
I don't think that's crazy at all. I've had several dream states. Very difficult to tell anybody because they come out of a normative lens of reality. And when you tell them something that may be predictive, you can measure it, but you can't give it definition of its structure and how it's going to happen. I remember before 9/11, I dreamt of planes taking off and exploding. I was like, oh, what's that about? That was 3 days beforehand. And I never told anybody because I thought if I say anything after the event, be like, yeah, okay, yeah, you're just making that up. But I wasn't. It was one of those things that I literally saw in my dreams these planes taking off on a runway. And they were old planes, they weren't brand new planes, and they would burn up in the atmosphere. I was thinking, what is all that about? Okay, it's fire. I started going to the symbology of it. And then 3 days later, I was walking past the gym and on their monitor, I saw the 9/11 and it took me right back into that space. So I want to understand this a bit more deeply. Can you describe what was actually going on in your body, in your day-to-day lived experiences? How did you know you weren't imagining it or making meaning from chaos?
I don't know that I did, Peter. To be honest, I wasn't really sure what all that was about. And when I reached outside for external validation of my experience, there wasn't any there. So I thought, okay, maybe these people are right. Maybe I've got a couple screws loose in it and I'm just not making sense. But there were a couple other things that were a little bit interesting. The house that I lived in, my daughters had broken this cabinet in the kitchen where we put the pots and pans, like completely cleanly broke it off the door. I am not one of those people that is a fixer upper or has any knowledge about how cabinets work or how to fix that, right? I'm the person that if something like that happens, then I need to hire somebody that knows how to work in that area. And I was just sitting in my kitchen floor and I was staring at the cabinet, willing it to, I don't know, willing it to reveal itself to me, I guess. Like, how do I fix this? Because I was out of a job and I couldn't go back to work because of the deficits related to memory and word finding and physical and not able to drive and so on and so forth. I was selling everything off that I possibly could in order to make the mortgage. So I was just like staring at this cabinet and I saw it like come apart and then it put itself back together. Like I saw the screws undoing and they separated and then the door came off and I just saw like the whole thing and I was like, huh, that's interesting. Well, let me see if that works. And so I went and got the screwdriver and some glue and like within 30 minutes the thing was completely fixed. I don't have any way of explaining that to you other than I stared at it for a long period of time and it started to shift in its inherent physicality, if you will.
I don't think that's strange at all. I took a look at your soul blueprint and I want to name something about your soul blueprint. It may create recognition because what you're describing is such precision. Because when I look at the architecture of your psyche, you were born with a very specific wound, a wound signature that sits right at the boundary between body and mind, between physical reality and trusting your perception. And that wound lives in the creative part of your psyche. And that's the part connected to spontaneous self expression, to joy, to what you give birth to from your own essence. When I think about what brain injury actually steals, it steals your capacity to think creatively, to express yourself freely, and to experience spontaneous joy. So the very ground of creative selfhood becomes unstable. That was already your core wound before the injury happened. The trauma, I would suggest, didn't create it. I would say that it activated it. It made it more conscious and forced you into an intimate relationship with it. But here's what I also find profound is that you also came in with enormous natural capacity for mystical perception and for accessing invisible realms that most people cannot perceive. These are very thin boundaries between ordinary consciousness and transpersonal consciousness. When your brain fragmented, those already thin boundaries got blown completely open. The injury forced you to consciously develop and integrate perceptions that were latent in you but not yet activated. And because the wound lives in the creative realm, you couldn't only suffer it passively, you had to make something from it. You had to give birth to an entirely different way of relating to consciousness itself. Does that language resonate with your lived experience?
I would say so. I would say also that it's kind of a gradient. What I mean by that is I've had multiple brain injuries. And when I listen to what you're saying, when I look at the other brain injuries that I sustained at different areas of my life, I can see the exact same pattern, just maybe in a little bit of a different way. I was more into the physical because we're really designed or taught to exist in the physical. And the more that I did that, the less of the other awareness that I would have, but then I would have another brain injury and it would knock out that emphasis on the concrete, on the physical, and it would open up other areas that is kind of terrifying at times to be perceptive of things in a way that maybe you can't explain and that maybe other people might call craziness, but it's not crazy when you can experience it in a way that is so profound and It's more true than everything else that's concrete and physical. I'm sure you can relate to that, where that level, it's more reality to me in many ways than all of the things that most people count on as being the only reality.
One of the most devastating patterns I hear from people with invisible conditions is the experience of medical dismissal. I don't want to disparage the medical profession because they do great work. What I've heard from many people are things like your labs are normal, it's all in your head, you just have to live with it. These phrases aren't only frustrating, I wonder if they create a secondary trauma because when your lived experience cannot be validated by the medical framework, surely you start questioning your own reality. Now, you work between worlds, so you have the medical credentials, but you also have the lived experience of being dismissed. And your practice seems to be about translating between dimensions the medical system cannot see. How did you learn to trust your own perception when, or if the system was telling you it wasn't real? And how do you help your clients navigate the gap between what they're experiencing and what can be measured?
It's a really good question. I guess for me, I can distinctly remember those moments like you're describing that I really had to question my own experience and my own reality. But really, at the end of the day, I think the honest truth is that we're the only ones who really get ourselves on all of those levels. And not everybody is in your body, right? Nobody else is in your body except for you. Nobody else is inhabiting that consciousness space that you are. And when everything else didn't work, when all of those things that were being suggested to me didn't line up with what was truth inside of me. It's almost like there was a sword. You could call it the sword of truth. That part of me inside, that solidarity of truth, that sword of truth that can cut through all the other things, was very clear inside of me. There is something else. There is something else. And so the power of that seed, the power of that blade, if you will. And I guess I'm relating to it like that because that's how it feels. It cuts through all that other stuff. It cuts through the no one's validating you, Sarah, right? It cuts through the it's all in your head. Like when you know that isn't your reality, there's almost a rushing instead of I'm going to cover my head and curl up under the covers and just disappear because no one believes me. For me, that sword showed up and it was like, I know what my truth is and I don't know where it is, but we're going to find it. Just that really, I don't think I've ever experienced anything in this world as strong as that blade of truth. And when it comes, there is no stopping it. So that's what allowed me to pursue other doorways. And it wasn't like, oh, that didn't work and you opened up another door and everything was perfect. Nuh-uh, not for me. It was like, we're going to knock on this door, no answer. Okay. We're going to knock on this door too and see what happens. Oh, I hear something in the background there, but no one's coming. And I didn't stop knocking on doors until I found something that was resonant with that blade. And truth can recognize truth and light can recognize light. So until I came across things that really felt aligned with what I knew on the inside, regardless of that external invalidation, and I just got really clear that I was going to line up with that. It's really important to me that people hear that. Nobody knows your truth like you do. Nobody, not even me, regardless of whatever credentials or experience or whatever I have, you're the one that knows you the best, right? And maybe we're not taught in this world to really pay attention to that, to really act from a place of that truth or to be able to recognize that. So it's really important to me to shine a light for people, if you will, and show them that you too have that in you. You maybe neglected it or you maybe ignored it or didn't pay attention to it for a lot of reasons, right? Because we're taught from an early age to listen to what other people say or to what our parents say or to what our pastor says, or like the list goes on. It's pretty exhaustive in terms of all the ways that we could bury that sort of truth, but that doesn't mean that it isn't there. And it doesn't mean that I'm some special person because I have some extrasensory perception, because in my experience, we all have that. It's just that some of us are more awakened to it than others. So if I can be a catalyst for the awakening of others for their highest good of all concerned, then I, in many ways, help them to be more empowered with their own blade of truth.
Are you essentially creating new language or new categories for experiences that don't necessarily fit the medical model?
I don't know if I have defined it in that way or thought about it in that way. I think the more unfolding, and I really feel like it's not like I've unfolded the end. Like if you're
Mm.
alive on the planet, you're always unfolding. You're always in a state of what I call becoming, right? Perhaps that's what that is. I don't know if we'll know exactly how that looks until later down the road and we look back and we go, oh, that's what was going on, right?
I'm getting the sense what I'm hearing is you're describing new language behind what you're saying that can give a greater and a deeper penetration into one's lived experience. Because what happens for the clients that you see when they finally encounter language that captures what they're living.
I think it is an unfoldment unto themselves. Sometimes we need that reference point, and many people that come to me looking for a reference point, it's not that one's not there. It's just kind of feels like they're walking in the fog and they're reaching for everything around, but they come up short. And I feel like one of the places that I'm able to fill that gap, because I too have been the person walking through the fog and feeling around for everything, is it's like I can be that solid thing, right?
Mm.
I can hang on to that. It's like, right, now we need to find all the other places you can hang on to because those aren't going to be the same as mine. Every one of us is designed and we're meant to be different.
One of the reasons I'm highlighting this is because I sense you have a very strong capacity for translation, for being bilingual between worlds, because your soul's evolutionary calling is literally pointing you towards bringing mystical perception into grounded, practical healing work, taking what exists in invisible realms and translating it into protocols people can actually use. But you also carry what I might call structural integrity under pressure, which is the ability to hold emotional intensity and maintain clear boundaries simultaneously. I see that you can be with people in their worst moments without collapsing into their pain or distancing from it. That's not very common, but that's what makes you trustworthy in threshold states. Your core wound, the one that turns inward and won't resolve, I think this keeps you humble. And I suggest that you can't offer cure because you don't have it yourself. What you offer is the companionship in the wound, the recognition of the pattern, the tools for living inside limitation with awareness, because the incurable wound is what actually makes your work credible. Any thoughts on that?
I really feel very strongly from that place of truth that I described earlier that you really cannot help anybody if you can't be on the level they're on, regardless of how dark or how horrible that might be. That's where we have to start. If we're going
Mm.
to lift, then I have to join you where you are, and we can go up from there. But in my experience, I can't help people if I'm looking down on them. That's not
Yeah.
how we lift people up won't work. There's an imbalance. There has to be a congruency, an alignment. You cannot do that if you're coming from a place of, oh, look at me, I'm up here and I've already
Uh,
been through
yeah.
that. I need to enter it with you. I need to go right in the muck with you, however awful, dark, whatever that is. And I just sit in my light and in my loving, and we lift from there. So I don't know that there's any other way to do it. If there is, I don't know that I would want to do it anyway
Mm.
because it's a relationship. I really feel that it's about a relationship. It's not like I'm the healer and you're the healee. No, there's quantum entanglement where it's a relationship in which people, I'm just seeing a spiral with almost like two strands, but they're together and they're interwoven. But one isn't better than the other. One's not higher than the other. One's not more complete than the other. We are all pieces unto ourselves, but unto each other just as much. if that makes sense.
Absolutely. I totally resonate with what you're saying. And I like to bring archetypal psychology into conversations. It allows me to get a better grip on people's situations and their psyche. Now, there's an ancient pattern that shows up across cultures about dismemberment followed by reconstitution. In other words, the self has to be torn apart before it can reorganize with new capacities. And the Greeks told us about Dionysus and the Egyptians about Osiris. So when we're talking about brain injury, I don't see this as metaphor because the brain, and correct me if I'm incorrect about it, but the brain literally fragments, neural networks dysregulate, and the
Hmm.
coherent sense of self gets disrupted. I sense you're pointing to something beyond just neural repair. You're talking about consciousness participating in reorganization, about quantum coherence, and about intention and awareness as active forces in healing. I don't know whether this is controversial territory, but I would suggest most neuroscientists would say consciousness is just an emergent property of brain activity. It's not something that can influence physical reorganization. So help me understand what you're actually seeing and working with. How does consciousness participate in neurological recovery? And the second part to this is what's the mechanism you're perceiving that conventional neuroscience misses?
I had to laugh a little bit because people on only the medical side of things think that what I'm doing is just absolutely outrageous. I've gotten quite a bit of backlash because of it from that. And obviously, I also have respect for our medical community and for evidence-based practice, but it has been my experience that we aren't just physical beings. So we have many levels, we have many layers. There's a part of us that has a meat suit, which is what I like to call it, okay, where you've got eyes and you got that wiggly tissue called a brain, and you've got bones, and yeah, all of those things are valid. But there's other layers, right? So we have emotional layers, and we have mental layers, and we have subconscious layers. And at the highest point of what we actually are, we are a soul, we are a spirit that's inside of that meat suit. So when you look at everything from the top down, and it's called downward causation. So the higher things permeate the lower things rather than the lower things permeating the higher things. When you look at it like that, we're missing it if we're only looking at one aspect of that. It's an incomplete picture. Not that it's not a valid picture, it is, but it's just one part of what we are, which is really a lot more complex than that. And experience through spirituality, through my brain injuries, however you want to call it, just my life and what my journey has been, is I prefer to relate to people more on that level of they're a soul, and they're a soul having all of these experiences on all these other levels, and none of them, I don't disregard any of them. So I don't compartmentalize. It didn't work for me, and it doesn't work for the people that I work with. So I don't go, oh, well, you should go here for this problem and you should go there for that problem. And if we're really going to heal, we really should be more holistic in what we're dealing with. I don't know if that answers your question, Peter, but I guess I just relate to people as the soul that they are. And when you come from that place, in that place, there's not a right or a wrong like we see here in the physical. So even if somebody maybe did something that they feel shameful about, that the rest of the world might see as bad, I just don't see it that way. I see what they were learning from that, how they can grow from that, how they can be more loving with themselves and forgive themselves for whatever it was that they're holding against themselves to break through the shackles of the prison that they've created. And why can I do that? Because I'm that person too that has created those shackles myself and had to learn what those were and break those free. I just relate to people in a totally different way. And it isn't necessarily accepted by just the strict physical medical side. But again, we're multidimensional. That's my experience. That's my truth. That's that sort of truth that I talked about earlier. And I just refuse to move from there. In the last couple of days, I had at least one person that felt that nervous system awareness is just not evidence-based practice. And I just have to like just smile because you are in the consciousness that you're in. And that's okay. I don't judge that person for that, but I just have to smile a little bit because what I'm offering people goes beyond what maybe people are traditionally thinking of.
Totally resonate. I find it all the time with the work that I do, which really addresses the soul from a different framework. I've always found that when someone's in denial, good luck in trying to convince them. If they're not willing to accept or explore rather than exploit their own truth or a truth, then they'll sit in denial. Through cognitive dissonance, they will re emphasize and reinforce that denial. There isn't a reciprocal opening, there's only reciprocal closure. You can't enter into a conversation with them. I always step away. And like you say, I totally agree with you. They may need to be in that consciousness to one day maybe learn something new or stay with it. And I respect that. For listeners to find out more about your work, can you give an example of how you teach someone to work with consciousness and more as a participant, as distinct from an observer in their own healing? What does that actually look like in practice?
It's an interesting question. I'm not exactly sure how to answer that, but I think that the first step in anything is to become more aware. A part of that is observation initially, especially when you don't exactly know what that is, but to become aware of different levels within yourself, it's always going to begin there. When you become aware, when you really become aware, you realize that's where you get your power from. So until you can see it for what it is, you can't enter into that and make change. If you're just living your life by the whims of the things that happen to you and the thoughts that you've been thinking for the last 20 years and the trauma that happened to you when you were 5, that's a powerless place. What I'm suggesting is that I want you to zoom out first, and I want you to see that you're connected to all things, that you essentially are the maker of your own reality and that energy follows thought. Not that it will be easy, right? But from that place, we do have a lot more agency of ourselves than what we think. We always have the opportunity to, instead of letting that tape in your head run that says you're not good enough, you're not good enough, you're not good enough because of whoever when you were in the 3rd grade and the 5th grade and your parents and your aunt and your uncle or whoever it was, they put that in your head and it became your baseline for yourself, for your life. And everything you do comes from that place of, oh, but I'm not good enough. Oh, but I'm not good enough. First of all, most people that are run like that don't realize that's running them. So they have to become aware of that pattern. And then they have to become aware of where's that tape coming from? It's not absolutely necessary that they go into that depth, but sometimes it really is. Sometimes being able to name that for its origin point is what gives them that personal power to be able to go, oh, I don't have to play that tape anymore. I'm going to make a new tape. I'm going to re-record over whatever that is. A really simple example of that would be instead of when you hear that in your head, because you've been cultivating the awareness of listening to your inner dialogue, talk back to that thing in your head that says, I'm not good enough. And instead, I want you to say, I am worthy. I am wonderful. I want you to say the exact opposite of whatever that thing is. And even if you don't believe it, it's okay. You don't have to believe it. You're rewriting that tape. And I want you to feel the way that you would feel if that new tape were true. And I want you to move forward with the actions of the things that you would do if you believe those things to be true. And I want you to live from that new place that you're creating because you have the opportunity to redesign your whole consciousness, your whole life. The opportunity for growth, for expansion are essentially limitless if you open yourself up to that expansiveness rather than allowing yourself to always participate from a place of contraction and smallness. So you don't have to do that, right?
So well said. As you probably know, I'm more of a intuitive observer. I do a lot of that in my work, and sometimes I'm off track and sometimes I'm spot on. But I get the sense you have a very strong signature of sudden disruption and breakthrough as a core life theme. You seem to have this capacity for discontinuous change for moments when suddenly everything reorganizes itself into a completely new pattern, which is essentially, I guess, what neuroplasticity is. We have sudden formation of new pathways and dissolution of old ones. I get the sense this is paired with access to non ordinary consciousness, to transpersonal perception, to realms most people cannot perceive. So when you talk about consciousness in healing, you're not theorizing, you're speaking from direct experience of dimensions beyond individual ego. But I get the sense, oh boy, yeah, so I get the sense that your body wound won't let you escape into pure spirit. I sense it forces you to honor both the material neuroscience and the mystical consciousness simultaneously. So you get dismembered at every level, neurological, psychological, spiritual, and then you have to learn to reorganize all those pieces into a coherent wholeness. So I get the sense that what you're teaching is essentially that ancient wisdom in modern language, and that the fragments can be consciously reassembled. So you can integrate across dimensions. So people that come to you overwhelmed, or if they're overwhelmed by fragmented information. They may have tried supplements or protocols or therapies or energy work, all in pieces. And the wellness industry mirrors the medical system by offering fragmented solutions. But healing requires integration across multiple dimensions simultaneously: the physical biology, the nervous system patterns, the trauma history, the consciousness dimension, the daily practice. How do you go about helping someone create coherence across all those dimensions without adding to their overwhelm? What does integrated healing look like?
I think it's different for every person that I've ever worked with. We're all very individual. I'm led by my soul and by my spirit and not by my brain. When I work with people, I follow that flashlight, if you will. So when I'm working with the body, for example, my daughter came over a few days ago. She said, Mom, my foot's hurting. Mom, my foot's hurting. So I said, okay, pull it up. So I started to do a little bit of release work on her foot. But my inner vision, it shows me often other layers. So for me, it looks like lines of energy that go from wherever that place is I am and they travel somewhere else. And it's like the body telling me through that communication, I need you to go here. So I moved up and she said, Mom, that's not where my problem is. It's my foot. It's not my ankle. And I said, well, I don't know, sweetie. Let me just work on this because the information that your body is giving me is that this is connected to that. The place where you think the pain is not actually the origin point of that pain. So give me a few minutes and let me work on it. And she was very resistant. Mom, it's not in my ankle, it's in my foot. She's like, oh, that hurts a little bit. And it's like, I want you to breathe and I want you to relax and I want you to really be present with whatever your body is processing right now, even if you feel resistance, even if you feel like that's not where it's supposed to be, even if you feel like it doesn't make sense. I want you to enter this moment with me. And so she did. And I worked on her for 5 minutes or so. And she's like, can you be done now? And I was like, well, how about you stand up now that we did something a little bit different and you just tell me, how did it go? She stood up and her eyes got really wide and she was like, oh my God, Mom, you fixed it. And I said, see, your body knows. I don't know how it works. The only way I can say it is my soul, my spirit, the part of me that is a minister, the part of me that is connected to those other realms, those other places. It has a lot more information about what's going on in the world physically than my brain does. So when I work with people, I don't enter into my brain space as much as I enter into that spiritual space. So before I work with anybody, I call in the light and I remove any negativity, any imbalance, any discomfort that might be a block for my connection with whoever it is, whether it's with you, Peter, today, or whether it's with my daughter, or whether it's with whoever it might be. I remove all the blocks and I ask the light to fill, surround, and enfold me, and that the part of me that is soul, that is spirit, that is greater than all of this, that's the consciousness. I want to work from the highest level of consciousness that's available to me. So when I work with people on all these other levels, it's very much the same way. It's not my brain that does it. I get these little communications of, oh, look at this here, but this is causing this other thing there, and it just opens a doorway. It's not like I say, this is how it is. It's just opening a doorway and saying, hey, have you considered that? And share whatever it is that comes forward. And I would say that over the years, the more that I have learned to trust that consciousness, the more I'm able to be resonant with people and offer them the level of multidimensional healing that it is. But I understand you're not the first person to say, how do you do that without people feeling completely overwhelmed when you say multidimensional? But I just encourage you to consider that who you are as a being isn't one dimensional. You are multidimensional. So if we work from a level of consciousness that integrates the multi dimensions of consciousness and the multi dimensions of beingness, then that's what I do it from. But it's not like a very specific protocol. For every person has a different protocol. My daughter had a different level there, and that was so like microscopic, very specific to her foot. But maybe she came to me and asked me about other levels, emotional levels, mental levels, and so on. So when I work with people, I just work from that level of the highest level of consciousness that's available to me. And I've done it long enough that I know to trust that above everything else.
Beautiful. I think I said earlier in the conversation that you are the bridge between the ethereal and the material, and you bring those into grounded protocols. You're able to weave those things that conventional medicine, I would suggest, keeps separate, and you've developed that integrative capacity. When you work with clients, what shifts for people when they finally experience coherence instead of fragmentation?
They become more open and expansive and accepting of whatever's going on, less as a judgment as a good or as a bad, but as it's okay to be who I am. It's okay to recognize my truth for what it is. The part of us inside that knows truth resonates with truth. So regardless of who you are, when you hear something true, there's a part of you that clicks into place on the inside and goes, that's true, right? Because who we all are is that spiritual being that I mentioned earlier. We might not all be aware of it, but that doesn't mean that it's not there.
I find it fascinating that the brain injuries you've experienced is the most materialist crisis possible because you can't bypass the body with positive thinking. The wound in physical reality, I see, has forced you to attend to the material dimension, whether you wanted to or not. So you had to integrate what may have been initially presented as tension. So the mystical and the material, the vision and embodiment, the consciousness and neuroscience, this is what I see is exactly what you're doing for clients. You're showing them how to create coherence across dimensions that seem contradictory. So in a sense, what I'm getting is that your wound became the bridge. I want to close with an intimate question because the mythological wounded healer carries an incurable wound. The wound doesn't close. It deepens into wisdom. You've talked about, and I think you've written about your own ongoing journey with remarkable honesty, the surgeries, recovery, the moment from nihilism to hope, but you're not claiming to be healed in the way the culture wants. How do you hold your own ongoing limitations, your own symptoms that may never fully resolve, while at the same time being a guide for others? What does wounded healing without the fantasy of cure look like in your daily life?
Well, Peter, I really feel that if I'm doing my life the way that I intend to, and I think everything begins with intention, then my intention is to always be in a state of transformation. So that's a
Mm.
movement. That's not a solid place. Transformation is a doing, it's an action. So everything I do and all the interactions that I have, I try to do from a place that is in movement. It's not a solid place. Of course, I still have challenges from all the things. We're all different anyway, Peter. We're all not the same. So I don't look at those as deficits. I just look at those as maybe like birthmarks, if you will, right? It's just a feature of part of who I am. Like the sensitivity to noise, to movement is off the charts for me. It's extremely difficult for me to go to a store because I feel everything that everybody feels all the time, and that can be very challenging. Doesn't mean that I avoid everything forever, but if I'm aware and I work with that instead of against that, then it helps me to know that, hey, we're going to go out today. We're going to have to be out in a crowded space today. So we're going to limit how long we're going to do that. We're going to make sure that we are loving and we call in the light. And then we're going to go back into that space that we feel more ourselves. So making sure that I create a balance that fits my life. If I don't sleep, ever since that last brain injury, or if I'm sick or under the weather, or if I'm entirely too stressed out, my brain doesn't function the way that it is as you're speaking to me right now. It's just a
Mm.
reality for me. That doesn't mean that I just need to quit life. It means that, there's an opportunity to adjust. So I'm really, really strict about my sleep schedule and nourishing my brain. I'm really aware of, hey, you're getting too stressed out. Your brain won't work like that. We've got to nourish that. We've got to work with that. We have to cooperate with the things that might seem like stumbling blocks, and we turn them into stepping stones. And we all have that opportunity available to us if we choose it. The poor me, it doesn't work for me. When I get into the poor me consciousness, I can't grow from there. Everything's a stumbling block. Everything trips me up. But if I can cooperate with it, whatever it is, whether it's sensitivities to lights or sounds or crowds, a brain that doesn't work well under sleep, when I cooperate with that, it's empowering because I can come and work with myself from that individualistic place of, hey, we know that this is what we need on this planet, and let's support that. So helping people to figure out what are those things about them, and none of us are the same. What are those parts of them that need more support, more alignment, more cooperation in order for them to grow into the person that they have the potential of continuing to become?
What I'm sensing is you're describing a practice, what I call the lens of coherence, which is the lens of practice, of an ongoing intimate relationship with the wound rather than transcending it. Now, that's profound. You have to be able to maintain your own coherence when your work is also about helping others find theirs. What sustains you?
I would say that the spirit, the light, the loving, that consciousness that is greater than me always sustains me in all things, regardless of what's going on. And it is my opportunity and it is my choice to choose into that rather than all the other levels that I could choose. So if I'm living my life with intention, with coherence, then I should always begin from that place because all things really and truly both begin and end with that place.
You offer such hope, not in the conventional sense of believing things will get better. I find it's something much more valuable and much more honest. It's recognition. I sense you're saying that one's invisible condition isn't invisible. You can see it. Your fragmentation makes sense. Your symptoms are intelligent responses, and the wound itself can become medicine. We've gone on this journey to explore brain injury as consciousness initiation and the medical system's shortfalls and consciousness participating in reorganization and integration across dimensions and wounded healing as ongoing practice. So I sense that the core teaching here is coherence, not cure, and understanding, not necessarily transcendence. I see you're offering that map. Would you agree with that or any thoughts on that?
I agree with that.
Do you have any parting words or messages? And where can people connect with your work?
I would suggest that who you are is something much greater than anything that you can experience on the level that you might find yourself on. So there's an opportunity to expand. I would suggest to surround yourself with people that lift you higher. And I would also suggest for you to always be the person that takes the opportunity to be the hand to help someone else up, because at the core of all of this, we're all connected to one another. Maybe it might not seem that way because you have a different physical body than I do, Peter. But on the inner levels, on the realms that matter, we are all interconnected. And so in that, there's opportunity to connect with me. My website is neurosynergyhealth.com. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me or whatever it is that you need. I have found that the right people that the spirit leads me to are the people that enter my life. So I consider that anybody that enters my world, it's on divine appointment. So if you feel like that's for you, feel free to reach out. And Peter, you're welcome to leave my website in your show notes if you want. When I made the website, I wasn't thinking how difficult it would be for people to spell that out. But I just like that neurosynergy so much, I just refused to change it.
This has been a great conversation. I know there's so much more we could go into, but I want to say something in summing up because I want people to understand something our culture has forgotten, and that is the ancient wisdom traditions knew. And one's wound is not failure. It's not a failure. I see it as an initiation. And consciousness sometimes requires breaking to expand. The self you were before the injury, before the trauma, before the illness, that self had reached its limit. It was structurally sound, but fundamentally inadequate for what needed to happen next. So life or fate or your own soul grabbed you and pulled you down into dismemberment, and not as punishment, as transformation. That doesn't make the suffering okay. This is not spiritual bypassing. And I'm not suggesting you should be grateful for brain injury or chronic pain or trauma, because the descent is real hell and the fragmentation is genuinely terrifying and the loss is profound and legitimate. But here's what I'm saying. No one is broken. I think we're being reorganized. We're in the middle of what the ancient Greeks called sacred dismemberment. The old neural patterns, the old identity structures, the old ways of being conscious, these had to fragment so something larger could emerge. And if we can learn to bring awareness into the reorganization process, to participate consciously in how the pieces reassemble rather than desperately trying to return to what was, then a new architecture becomes possible. And I see that the work that you do, Sarah, the work that I do, the work all genuine wounded healers do, we're guides between worlds. You translate between the medical and the mystical, and you make visible what the system cannot see. And there's a recognition that initiation, that when it's happening, because you've walked that path yourself. But here's the transmission that's coming to my mind is that we are our own primary healers, not in the toxic sense that you should be able to fix yourself, and not in the dismissive sense of it's all in your mind, just think positive, but in the deeper, more challenging sense that your consciousness, your awareness, your intimate attention to your own system, this is the medicine, the protocols, and the supplements and therapies they cannot provide on their own, because no one else can reorganize your neural networks for you. No one can regulate your nervous system for you, and no one can integrate the fragments of your consciousness for you. But guides like Dr. Sarah Young can map the territory, can offer tools, can create containers, can witness the process. But you're the one walking through the underworld. You're the one learning its language. You're the one being initiated. And that initiation, as brutal and unwanted as it is making you into someone who will eventually be able to guide others through similar terrain. This is the wounded healer's path, because the wound that won't heal becomes the medicine you offer, not someday after you're cured, but now, in the midst of it, in the messiness of it, and through intimate relationship with what won't resolve. So if you're in the middle of that process right now, if you're fragmented, if you're lost, if you're exhausted from trying to put yourself back together the way you were, trust that reorganization is happening, not on your timeline and not in the way you choose, and not toward the destination you thought or you believe you were heading, but it's happening. Consciousness is reorganizing itself through you. The scattered pieces are seeking new coherence. And I want to conclude by saying, look, the material lens says, yes, tend to the biology. The ethical lens says, yes, demand to be seen and validated. The human lens says, yes, honor your actual lived experience. The universal lens says, yes, consciousness participates in physical reality. And lastly, the practice lens, which is so important, says, yes, you have to live this integration day by day, moment by moment, choice by choice, breath by breath. That's integration. That's coherence across all 5 dimensions. I see that's the deepest healing there is. Not cure, not transcendence, but wholeness that includes the wound, wholeness that honors limitation, wholeness that creates meaning from suffering without denying its reality. And I see in Sarah's case, the wound has become the doorway. The fragmentation is the reorganization. The descent is the initiation. We walk through, we participate, we bring awareness to the process. We have to trust that what's being dismembered is making space for something the old self could not contain. And if you need a guide, if you need someone who can see what maybe the medical system cannot, who can validate what seems invisible, and who can translate between the neuroscience and the numinous, reach out to practitioners like Dr. Sarah Young, who've earned their authority through her own descent. She's here. She recognizes you. She knows the territory. Sarah, thank you for walking this transmission with us. Thank you for your profound work in the world and your willingness to speak the uncomfortable truth that healing doesn't always cure, but can mean something deeper, something more coherent, and the relationship with the incurable. And I want to thank this for trusting your own process enough to hear these words, because you're not imagining you're suffering, you're not broken, you're being initiated. And that initiation, though you didn't choose it, I would suggest it's sacred work. The wounded healer carries the wound as credential. Live yours with awareness. That's the medicine. Dr. Sarah Young, thank you very much.